morning, whatever it is where you are, everyone, and welcome to our May POGO Club. This meeting is being recorded as a big warning sign just comes up on everyone's screen. This is so that we can put it on our website, so please be aware of that. Today we've got a fantastic presentation and panel on data and transparency for social value procurement. And Abby Semple from Procurement Analysis has put this panel together, and I'm going to hand over to her to set some of the background and to introduce our wonderful speakers. Abby, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Anne. And yes, I was just saying I've been really looking forward to this one. The idea came out of some of the discussions we were having within this group in preparing a submission to the Green Paper consultation. And one of the issues that we touched upon in the submission was transparency. And a lot of questions coming up around the connection between data and transparency in procurement and the more traditional focus of this group, which is social outcomes. So, is an increase in transparency always a good thing in terms of social outcomes? Is it sometimes a neutral thing? Is it sometimes a negative thing? What do we mean by transparency? And the question of who is actually responsible for that. So who has to do the work of collecting procurement data, presenting it? Is that perhaps in some cases an excessive burden to put on a small local authority, for example? So interesting discussions that many of you were involved in. And we thought this topic really deserved a closer focus. And we know that there's a number of people working on this very issue coming from various different backgrounds and perspectives. And we thought it would be a good opportunity to bring together some of these people today. And we are hoping to have another session on data and transparency perhaps in the autumn. But for today, we're very lucky to have a really excellent panel. So we've got 4 speakers lined up for you today. And I think that what I'll do is I'll introduce each of them just before they speak. So we are going to kick off with Peter Smith, who will be known to many of you. He has an extensive experience in procurement, both public and private sector. And he's also acted as an advisor to the National Audit Office, also president of SIPS, so various different hats that he's worn in the procurement field. And he might be known to some of you as the long-term editor of Spend Matters website, and also more recently quite a distinguished author with a number of books to his credit. I think I see one of them behind you there, Peter, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, I have to say, but I hope to. I'm sorry, I've been a bit busy for the past few months, but I will definitely pick it up soon. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Peter. And what we did is we included in the agenda a number of prompts, which we're hoping the speakers will respond to, around this whole issue of how data and transparency can contribute to building back better, what the data themselves look like, and how we should use them. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abby. And I have to say, on that very same bookshelf, your excellent book sits as well, which I think I reviewed for the website. It came out, if I remember correctly. Right, so I've got 7.5 minutes, so I'm going to talk quickly. Apologies for that. I'm not going to go through the CV, and Abby just summarised that very nicely. I've had a long-term interest in public sector. I've worked in the public sector a lot. I'm also interested in bad buying, and actually my next book is going to be about good buying, procurement with purpose. So social value in public sector terms, but also the net zero agenda, how better procurement can support human rights and diversity in the supply chain, and stop deforestation and all these wonderful causes that we're concerned about now. So that's my sort of latest big interest. And I did a paper for the Reform think tank recently on radical transparency. I should say I was actually the co-author, and the other person got cold feet at the last minute, or rather their board did, because they work for a firm that does quite a lot of consulting work for government, and they thought maybe they shouldn't be seen to be even slightly critical of what the Cabinet Office was doing, which I suppose we were in the paper. Particularly actually on things like the Green Paper being very weak on transparency, and I might come back to that within my 7.5 minutes. So we tend to think of transparency and the media and so on as a tool to increase public trust, and all the stuff recently with the Good Law Project and PPE scandals and all the rest of it. It's all about getting that into the open so the public can see that government is spending our money properly. But we argued in the paper that actually the bigger prize in terms of actual value for money and long-term benefit for the taxpayer and the citizen would come from better flows of data, information and knowledge within the public sector, the commissioners, the buyers, the budget holders. And I think the first question we were asked to answer was, do we make good use of procurement data? And the answer is, well, I think people like Ian make great use of the data that is available, but the problem is there's just an awful lot that isn't available. So to me, the big prize comes from the people actually spending money, the buyers, the commissioners, being able to look at what's going on elsewhere in the public sector and work out just what works, which evaluation processes work well, which commercial and contractual models, where do outcome-based approaches work well, where don't they work well, what's social value delivering, what's good practice and what is bad practice. And that's all within the procurement process. Then we have a whole host of potential information and data around supplier performance. And that's mentioned in the Green Paper, to be fair. But at the moment, you know, Ian can tell us how much is being spent with Capita and how many contracts they've won and things like that. But are they doing a good job for government or not? And the answer is, I don't think anybody knows, you know, other than beyond a single contract that somebody might be managing. So that internal knowledge flow is almost non-existent, I would say. So starting from the point of view of everything should be secret, then grudgingly let out bits of information, let's turn it round. So let's aim high, hence my picture of the Matterhorn, and start from the position that everything should be out there. And then, okay, I accept we'll work back a bit. The top secret stuff. And I think there's a good argument. And I think Pedro Tellez and or Albert Sanchez Grails have made this argument that there's perhaps the insiders should be able to see more than the general public. And I think there's something in that argument as well. But the technology is there, is coming to make all this possible quite soon, I think. And what I'm really, I think we should be aiming for is being able to share the successes and the good practice. And I used to write about stuff on Spend Matters. I'd interview someone from Slough Council and find they're doing something really amazing in some area of social care, health and social care, a really novel, innovative way of running the procurement process. But, you know, unless I happen to interview them and stick it on the Spend Matters website, nobody else would know. We also don't learn from our failures. And that really annoys me. Given we're talking to an Oxford group here, the Oxford Council parking fiasco recently, 1.6 million paid to an unsuccessful bidder. Now, to be fair, they did a report and they put a redacted version in the public domain, but it didn't actually explain what went wrong. What was the failure in the procurement process there? I live in Surrey. Half a dozen Surrey health organisations ended up paying Virgin Health millions of pounds because of a failed procurement process a few years ago. We don't even know how much they paid. It was bound up in confidentiality agreements. And we certainly don't know what went wrong in the process. You know, somebody messed up there, and you'd think every other commissioning group in health should know about it. In my bad buying book, the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency paid over £100 million to Bechtel because of a messed up procurement process. Now, we learned a bit about that because it actually came to court and the judge wrote a 200-page document about it, which is well worth reading. But, you know, unless you plowed through that, nobody else in the public sector probably picked up the key points. And there were a couple of really simple but key learnings there that should be tattooed on every public sector procurement person's arm. So, yeah, we need to get the information out there, get more and better. It's not just data as such, it's not all numbers. And I think there are opportunities. Hopefully there'll be some radical changes in public procurement. The technology is getting much better, but at the moment I'm still not convinced there's a real appetite within government to go this way. So let's all make the argument, I think, for radical transparency. And I've lost the clock on my screen, so I can't tell how long I spoke for. But
that's all right. Thank you, Peter. You've kept well to time. That's excellent. Thank you. I think Rory, you wanted to pick up on one of the points that Peter had raised as well.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Peter and all the panelists as well, and also thank Abby for pulling this together. And Abby suggested this and has put it together, and a plug for what this session. Thank you for this, and also encouraging other people to do the same as issues come up, and people have started to do that. So that's really helpful. I realize I'm not on video. Sorry. So thanks, Abby, and more people should do this. Thanks, Peter, for highlighting this. One of the things that's really clear is that, in addition to the accountability reasons for being transparent, there is this public management aspect. I think that with social value, this becomes even more unclear because we're no longer just looking at issues of wasting money, but also about how do we prioritize or make social priorities. And also I think that there's an effect potentially for the VCSE sector that needs to be understood. And then yet another area is well, what about the inequalities created here? So there are the point that really resonates with me with Peter's argument is that there's more than the accountability argument here. There's the variety of different things going on, and I'm really excited to hear from the panel about the various ways, including around social value, that we can lean on data and more transparency as we look to improve the performance of the overall procurement system.
Great, thanks for that, Rory. And I think that actually leads us on well to our next speaker, Dan, because Dan comes from very much a social value background. Danny Banks established the Social Value Exchange back in 2015, and I think I met you around that time, Dan, when it was in its sort of early days, and I understand it's come on quite a lot since then. So what it is quite an innovative piece of technology that uses auctions essentially to maximise social value within the procurement process. Dan, prior to that, has quite a lot of experience in terms of working with the public sector, both at local, regional and central government level. So Dan, the floor is yours if you want to respond to our prompts for today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Thanks for organising and for inviting me, and thanks to everybody else who's taking part and joined the call. I wanted just to focus in initially on outcomes. I mean, in terms of one of the prompts that was included in the email that went out, there was a reference to social outcomes, and that feels to me like almost like a bit of a form of shorthand for the kind of broad change that we want to see, and that's absolutely fine. But local place-based outcomes have been part of kind of local government lexicon for as long as I can remember. So going back 20 years when I first started working in the sector. Whether that's commissioning or community outcomes. So these outcomes in a very real sense should be part of local government's measurement frameworks, and they're absolutely crucial for for our technology, for the social value exchange to work. Our process begins with the identification of these local place-based outcomes. We then use that outcome to make sure that we can channel capacity building resources to those local VCSE organisations that are contributing to those same local outcomes. Now, whenever we begin that conversation with local government, our local government customers, it's not always apparent that procurement folk are aware of these local outcomes, or whether even that the council has done the work to identify those local outcomes themselves. Without these things in place, without these local place-based outcomes in place at the head of that measurement framework, I think that whether we've got the data or not is almost irrelevant. Where we do have those outcomes and they form a starting point for that measurement framework, we then have the challenge of getting the data. whether we get that data from suppliers or whether we get it from those local VCSE organisations, that takes time. That's a cost. In the form of, in terms of the former with the suppliers, is it going to reduce their margins? Yes. In terms of the local VCSEs, can they afford to do it at all, given the funding cuts that they've had to experience over the last 10, 15 years? So again, assuming that the data is there, assuming that the outcomes are in place, how on earth do you actually get the data? I mean, contract management functions in local gov have been hollowed out over the last 10 years, so that which means if suppliers don't provide the data on those community benefits that they're supposed to have realised, that data often, it remains uncollected. And I think the extent to which contract managers are willing to penalise suppliers for not providing that data is at best unclear. I mean, anecdotally, I've heard that they won't, especially if delivery of the wider contract spec is going to be undermined. In other words, the failure to deliver on social value obligations is something that councils may be willing to ignore so as not to hinder the delivery of the core contract, and that's just the reality that we see on the ground. I think looping back round to outcomes, I mean, my understanding of the new central government procurement policy is that there's going to be a new strategy every year. So there'll be a new outcome or outcomes identified and attached to that strategy each year, whether it's levelling up or whether it's the pandemic response. Again, they are quite big macro outcomes, which are going to need to be interpreted and to be made meaningful within local context. Again, that's good, but again, it's going to require resource. Once those outcomes are in place, you can construct that measurement framework and your APIs, but then again, you've got to work out how to collect the data. So for us, the way that we sort of swerve that issue of resource is that we look to incentivize our stakeholders to give us data. So for example, on the social value exchange, we essentially pay local VCSEs to give us their output data. So what are they doing with the resources that we've enabled them to get via the platform? They give us that data, and we indirectly we pay them to do that. And I think similarly, there should be something around perhaps incentivizing suppliers to agree to give data, in terms of how you structure your tender processes. If you can say to suppliers, if you agree to give us the data, we will give you more tender points. I think at the back end of that process, there's probably a role for visual performance management. And again, that's something that we have as part of our system. So we track the delivery of social value of community benefits, and we share that performance of local stakeholders visually, and we share it publicly. And it's a great way to celebrate good performance by government suppliers. It's also a way to share bad performance. And it's amazing how much that does focus the mind. So I think I'd probably sum up by saying that we have to recognize that data is valued, that we have to look at smart ways to incentivize stakeholders. And I would argue for a degree of transparency to drive performance.
Great, thanks for that, Dan. And I think you've really brought out some of the other issues, which we've certainly discussed. Many people in this group have experience linked to sort of measuring social outcomes in various contexts as well, and the sort of link between that and some of the broader purposes of transparency, including those that were sort of identified in the green paper, I think is quite interesting, because sometimes we see them as two quite different activities, but really obviously we're all reliant on the same type of data, whether that's linked to particular contract outcome or to procurement function more broadly. And it's just a question then, as you say, of how we actually get that meaningful information out. And what that means, at some level, it's an individual who has access to information who has to make it available in some form that the rest of us can tap into. Okay, thanks for that. So Genevieve Maitland-Hudson is our next speaker, and I'll just introduce you, Jen, and then give the floor to you. So Jen is the director of the Learning and Influence at the Social Investment Business. Prior to that, she had a distinguished career in academia, which led her to setting up a social economy data lab, and she's also published widely on issues related to the social economy, data and evaluation, and I know she has some experience linked to some of the issues that Dan was discussing as well. So Jen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I don't know how distinguished it was. I think it was probably not remotely distinguished, and it's very long ago. Yeah, it's really interesting listening to the previous two speakers. I guess at SIB, we sort of speak for the social economy particularly, and the VCSEs who do a lot of the delivery of contracts, or who are subcontracted to deliver bigger contracts. I guess I have an interest particularly in the data surrounding that. It often feels like it's an area that gets forgotten, that there's data that is sought from beneficiaries, so outcomes within communities or within particular populations, and then that's fed up to the commissioner level, and then lots of thought is given into to whether this has been value for money or not. And then what gets lost in that is the value to the social sector organisations that deliver a lot of this, that are doing a lot of the work. I worry a lot when there's talk about getting data out of these organisations, as if this is somehow something that they're a transition point, they're a tube through which this information has to be sucked up from the ground level and fed up to the area where it really matters. I don't think that's the best way to get good quality data out of those organisations. For one thing. For another, I think it's really unclear to them at that stage what the benefit is. Why is it useful for them to collect this data if it's being collected on behalf of someone else? It has clear impacts on the quality of the data that's collected as well, I would say. So what we do at SIB, so where I think this is, so just to clarify where we've particularly had, we have interesting information on procurement for those not familiar with social investment business. So SIB was delivered the Future Builders Fund, the Community Builders Fund. These are kind of some of the first social investment funds that were set up by government. This is all prior to Big Society Capital being set up. And those funds, particularly Future Builders, was set up in order to increase the amount of public procurement that was being delivered by the social economy. So these are organisations that receive blended finance from SIB in order to grow their contracting income. And they have grown their contracting income very successfully. The findings are really clear. All of them, more or less, in different sectors of the social economy, have grown their contracting income. They have typically grown as well their employment base. They have, for many of them, they also diversified the kind of procurement that they were doing, so the kinds of contracts that they delivered on behalf of government. And there's lots of interest in here as well, because this goes back a long way. So the average length of a Future Builders loan is 14 years. Many of these loans went out in 2003. So that we have a lot of data over a pretty considerable period of time that shows what happens to organisations that are involved in public procurement. So what happens to organisations who deliver contracts. And that's been really interesting. You also see these kind of key points in that process. You know, it's a long enough period of time that the financial crisis is clear, and that also the start of austerity is clear in the effects on these organisations. So I kind of would like to speak up a little bit on behalf of those organisations, the value to them of being involved in procurement, and the kind of data that we could look at to see whether those contracts are working for VCSEs. And we have a couple of ways that we do that. So one is that we have a pretty straightforward metric on financial resilience that we have developed and tested, and are trying to test with other, particularly social investors, but would be interested in looking at working with people more broadly involved in procurement to see whether it's a useful metric. It's based entirely on published data that already exists. So we're not asking VCSEs to produce anything else. This is based on the accounts that they already have. And we also try and look at a series of, I'm sorry, my son has a splinter and I can hear him crying in the background. Hopefully my husband is resolving this issue. Yeah, so we have a series of things that we look at as well around good governance and the quality of the employment, the equalities practices. There's a bunch. This is all public and on our website. You can have a look if you're interested. And again, that's all based on existing published information. So we don't ask people to collect new and different things on just for us. This is making better use of available data. And I think that's something that we could continue to do more of. So that's, I guess, where I come from when we're thinking about procurement, is to not lose the perspective of those VCSEs and to think about the different parts of that chain. So to think about the outcomes, and obviously GoLab is very focused on those outcomes, and there is important information that needs to be considered in the commissioning chain as well. But VCSEs aren't just they're not just a means to an end. They are organizations, they employ people, they do things in their local economies, and understanding them should feature as part of this, and thinking about the data that helps commissioners to understand the effects of the kind of procurement they're doing on those organizations is important. But I also think there is a direct impact on outcomes. So, you know, if you have organizations that employ people well and on good terms, you will get better outcomes. So there is some causal stuff to look at here as well, and I think again that sometimes gets lost in some of the conversations about data.
Great, thanks so much for that, Jen. You've really helped to sort of put a human face on the data, at least coming from the VCSE perspective, and I think that's important to keep in mind if we're going to start you know, asking for more data, you know, where is it coming from, and what is the actual impact on people in terms of both what we're able to analyze as the outcome and where it's coming from. Great. I'm going to go, we're keeping well to time, I think. I'm going to go to our final panelist. If you have any questions that you want to put to any of our panelists, you're welcome to either put them in the chat or I'll open the microphone after we hear from Ian. But please do think about any questions or issues that you want to bring up based on what we've heard so far. So Ian McGill is our final speaker on the panel. He's worked in public procurement for over 25 years. You wouldn't know it to look at him, obviously, but 15 of those were spent on the data side. And he's the founder of Spend Network, which I believe most of you will have come across at some point, which was the world's first open database of public procurement data based on the Open Contracting Data Standard. And published, amongst many other interesting articles, the recent one on the gender pay gap in public procurement in the UK, which was really of interest to me because I'm working on a European project around gender issues in public procurement. And just so I pass that on to a number of my European colleagues who are envious of the level of data available, but not of the results in terms of the actual pay gap, which exists both amongst government departments here and amongst contractors, the strategic suppliers to government. So do have a look at that if you're interested in that issue. But I'll hand the floor to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Abby. Let me just start my timer to make sure I don't overrun. There we go. What I'll do with my short amount of time is just tell you a little bit about what we do in terms of our goals and how we work, and then I'll present some of the findings from that gender pay analysis. Basically, what we exist to do is to gather up all of the procurement data in the world and try and raise it to a grade where it can be analysed. Actually, that's a really quite taxing thing to do when so much of the data is missing. But we give it a good go. And one of the things that we're really interested in is being able to, precisely as Peter described, this sort of notion of radical transparency, which is about delivering a better understanding of what is happening within contracts to be able to then make better decisions about what works and what doesn't. Thank you for posting the link, Abby. And the real principle here is, you know, actually when we bring data sets together and increase the speed and accessibility of data, we can actually do some really interesting things. I'll put something into context for you. We estimate that the value of government procurement globally is $13 trillion a year. That's about 11% of our global GDP. Now, a lot of that is in China, which we don't anticipate becoming open anytime soon. But if you think about that and how that could be used to influence things like carbon and gender pay, actually, here's government wandering around with an awfully big stick that they're ignoring. You know, this leverage point that is not being taken up to really make our industries more productive, more efficient. And you know, another piece of analysis that we've done was to analyze the number of tenders that received just one bid. It's 22% in the UK. 22% of our OJU tenders receive one bid. Now, if I was at CCS, I wouldn't be worried about any other thing than that single number. And I'd be getting up every morning going, how the hell can I make our market, this market worth nearly 300 billion, more competitive? Unfortunately, you know, we don't see that data flow in and out of organizations in the same way to make people think again. But let me show you, I will share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to, oh no, that's the wrong screen. Hang on, I'm looking for, it was there when I last saw it. No, hang on, let me stop that share and then I'll bring it up on forgive me. There we go. Can you see, what can you see there?
Can't see it at the moment, Ian. It looks like a blank screen to me.
The live demo of the lack of transparency.
The worst thing about this is that I tested it.
Blank screen.
I tested it just.
Yeah, it did work, didn't it, earlier on? I don't know.
No, that's my GitHub. It's not working. This is a nightmare.
Don't worry, just describe us what you were going to show.
Well, if I just very simply talk about the gender equality research that we did, was we're the first people in the world to bring together contracting data and gender analysis. And you'll be able to, if you click on the link in the chat, you can see it. What that does is we were able to not just look, as Peter was so talking about, you know, like these little snippets of information. You might say, oh, well, look, Microsoft have got a gender inequality of this nature. We can actually look at the entire category for construction and turn around and go, oh, we have a problem here. Interestingly, the more money you spend on construction, the more likely you are to experience a gender pay gap in the supplier. So what can we do to counter that in future procurements? Equally, the reverse is true for consulting. So smaller consultancies and professional services companies are much more likely to have a significant gender pay gap than the larger consultancies. So is that something that we should be rewarding? Are there other problems that come with that? It's really interesting that we can see this data now and we can link it up and really examine how governments perform, both comparative to their own gender pay gaps, but also to the future going forwards, and actually make decisions based on real data. Now, would we want to make a decision entirely on gender pay? Probably not. But would we want to see that factor being considered in companies that have refused to move their gender pay to a more equal basis in the last 5 years? Oh yeah, I would. So these are the sort of decisions that we can now make, provided the data is moved with a certain speed and alacrity. One final note is that we're just before I got on this call, we're working on a project to evaluate the carbon intensity of every contract in the UK and hopefully out to the whole of Europe as well. So we're now starting to build carbon estimates into future contracts. So we can say, look, if you do nothing, your carbon will continue to this level. If you start at your key leverage points at renewals between now and 2030, we anticipate you'll get to carbon neutrality if you take 30% or 20% off your carbon outputs in each of your renewals in the next 3 years. So, or the next few years. That's the sort of thing we can do. I think it's a really interesting area. And if what I'd really appreciate is if you find that gender pay gap stuff interesting, please share it with others. And that's my 7 minutes. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Ian, and some really interesting examples. I look forward to seeing the carbon data as well. But you know, just an example of how putting together this type of data can have, you know, certainly spur people to think carefully about what's happening in terms of specific social outcomes and get, you know, a level of detail on that. I think some of the discussion in the chat is around, you know, does anybody really care? Do people take this seriously? And, you know, that's maybe a separate question, but I think we've got to get to a point where we understand, you know, what can be done with the data. And unfortunately, it does seem to be a lot of the time that it's when, you know, it's used, you know, Rory mentioned at the beginning, this, the Good Law Project, you know, this type of data around, you know, the extreme failures in procurement. And again, Peter obviously picks up on these in his book as well. You know, that kind of gets the headlines. So the question I have, I guess, really for all of the panelists or anyone else who wants to come in really is, you know, how do we get beyond sort of the headline grabbing, you know, these are things that are going seriously wrong with procurement, into a more sort of regular analysis of, you know, here's what went wrong, here's what we could have done better, you know, in a way that sort of works on a day-to-day basis and is useful. You know, and one of the things that Peter, you mentioned in your report for reform is around, you know, sharing within the public sector as well, not just sort of external facing, but internal facing as well. So I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that. Does anyone have any ideas of how we get to a more sort of business as usual sharing of procurement data?
Somebody raised their hand, I think.
Okay, yeah, I see Malcolm has his hands up. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Abby. Well, I've been following what you said with much interest. So just a couple of short points. I mean, it seems to me that part of the problem that we have in procurement is, I mean, it's partly that we're not collecting the data, but we're not really analyzing from a data-driven perspective what are the optimum tools to use and ways of managing procurement, because we don't really have the data to show which is the most effective. But coming back to some of the key points, because we're talking now essentially about what I call the strategic use of procurement, not just procuring on best price, but on delivered social benefits, particularly on climate change, which is coming up. The European Commission did publish some data. And I don't know whether it's been updated, but when I was working on the legislation, we had the data from different countries to see how many contracts have been let solely on the basis of price. What percentage of contracts were there no other criteria put in for assessing the best value of the contract, the most economically advantageous tender, to use that criteria that we now built into that. And as a starting point, we should be starting to do that. And if social value is becoming an imperative, then you clearly have to track that. First of all, in the way it's embedded in the tender, and then secondly, whether it's delivered. You know, I don't think there should be any argument about that. If that's a demand of the tenderer to deliver X social value or Y zero carbon performance, then that should be a performance criteria. And if we have to design more incentive-driven contracts based on actually meeting those criteria, that's where we should be moving. But the basic problem is we don't have any data framework to do that. And I'm worried the green paper will make matters worse, because actually it's saying, well, you can now design your own contract, provided you meet a certain number of criteria. Now, I mean, if we're already in trouble because people don't have that data, and people are looking for best practice examples, and there are some guiding tools at the moment that people can at least use, but actually then inviting people to make up their own contracts, I think is not going to improve matters at all.
Well, it's interesting because the green paper and other more learned people have said this. We could get the situation where everybody's inventing their own new procurement procedures. And I was talking to a procurement director in a very large quasi public sector organization who's going to do that. You know, he's going to develop his own 3 or 4 procedures. And but then you'll have the threat that if the Cabinet Office don't like them, they can come and intervene and take over your procurement department. So you're sort of between a rock and a hard place. So I'm not convinced by the green paper making things simpler by any means. But it's probably a bit of a digression from what we're talking about here, but it's an interesting point. And it does play into data actually, because yeah, it just makes things more difficult. So.
Thank you. Well, digressions are no stranger to this group, and they often lead us in interesting directions. So no worries about that. I wonder if I might be able to bring in Samantha Butler. Are you still with us, Samantha? Because you had put a comment in the chat earlier around the social value framework, and I just wondered if you wanted to expand on the point that you'd raised there.
Yeah, I just think the wording sounded like there was a planned, scheduled annual review or change of the social value model and the measures that will be in the list of options that departments can use, and that's not the case. So I don't think that's what Dan meant, but I just wanted to clarify that because, as Peter said, it wouldn't necessarily be the right thing to do. So.
Right. So there are obviously a number of different themes identified in that, but it's not sort of a rotating. You know, this year it's
no, it's not.
And
We're
next
not
year it's
saying, right, every year we wipe the slate and we start again. No, not at all.
Okay. Great, because that's obviously one of the other drivers for some of this data is around the new implementation of the new social value model, and how do we make that a reality. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Peter. Do you have another point?
Just a quick comment on that. When we're talking about social value and monitoring, in a sense, it's just another aspect of contract management for me. And I did a lot of work back in the day with National Audit Office on contract management, which is generally done still, I'd say today, pretty badly, actually in the public and private sector. You know, if procurement is seen as not glamorous and not high profile, contract management's like another level down. And monitoring what's being delivered in terms of social value, holding suppliers to account, collecting the information, managing their performance is really what should be done on all the different aspects of contract performance, not just social value. But the problem is we're starting from a position where contract management isn't done well, even in terms of basic delivery to what the contract says in many cases. So how people are going to measure, you know, the number of apprentices taken on in Camberley, building the new sports centre and so on, will be an interesting challenge, let's say.
Yeah, well, can I maybe invite Jen? I don't know if you'd like to respond to that, because I think on the one hand, yes, I can see the point that it is it is just another form of contract management or another aspect of contract management. But is there something special about the social value or social outcomes that sort of demands a different type of data, different type of transparency, either because of the people involved in delivering it or because of what we want to get out of it? I don't know if you have a view on that, Jen, or.
I think that there's an almost philosophical point about data that involves people and data that doesn't, and an awful lot of social outcomes involve people. And so I do actually tend to think that it is different to think about gathering data from people and sharing that data in different ways than it is to thinking about value for money or analysing pounds and pence and other non-sentient things. So to that extent, yes, I do think it is different, and it does take a degree of care, both at every level, actually, from collection all the way through to sharing and use, because we should have proper governance and representation of data subjects when the data comes from human beings. So I think my short answer is yes. My longer answer is that what that involves in practice is not always particularly well thought through. And I do think that we have in social impact work and impact investing and social investing as well to an extent. We did default to quite an extractive approach and to treating this kind of data as another form of contract management. And I'm not persuaded that it is. And I think some of the difficulties that we've come up against are precisely, particularly with the validity and reliability of data, are because it wasn't thought through particularly, and it wasn't considered that it was a different kind of thing, a different source of data that was being collected.
Okay. I see Ben Taylor had come in with a comment there, so I might come to you in the moment, Ben, if you want to expand upon your comment there in the chat. But in the meantime, I see, sorry, I don't know who had their hand up first, but I'll go to Ian and then Rory, if that's all right.
I'll make a point that I think is really interesting here, that the e-procurement tools that most of government are using, even the ones that have been built by government, fundamentally don't generate data or record data that is fit for analysis. Now, there are lots of different reasons for that, which I won't go into now. But and you know, a lot of this isn't, you know, it's a lack of not really understanding the complexity of analyzing data. So you get pushed into, you know, okay, we need Contracts Finder or we need FTS immediately. Oh, let's make it. We've already got a contractor, we'll build it, and then we'll think about what happens with the data. Well, with Contracts Finder, you can't actually determine what's a contract and what's a tender specification. So we can't, you know, there's a lot of problems that we inherit by not having systems that generate data that's useful. And this is why the Open Contracting Data Standard is so important. We're getting there, but we really need to think about the analysis that we want to do before we put a system in front of people. And
just, Ian, as far as I understand, OCDS does include information on contract management as well, but is that something, is that to what extent is that actually present in the analysis that you're doing, the information on the after, you know, the post-award phase compared to the actual tender phase? Is it a sort of even availability or an uneven availability, or how would you characterize it?
To be fair, I know of 3 frameworks that publish data about the performance of contractors on those frameworks.
Okay.
But bear in mind that we see about 60 new frameworks a week.
Yeah, so it's a tiny, not even a drop in one of the
that's 3 in the entirety. And another thing is that we have a problem in the US where they do require contractors to publish details of how well, or buyers to publish details of how well contracts went at the end of a contract, and it's just hagiographic nonsense. I mean, everyone goes, oh, they're the best contractor that ever lived, because they just don't want to be sued. So you've got to be, I think we've got some challenges to work through on this around how we record value for money, and what you want is the data to appear on a consistent basis as you go through the contract and to be incontrovertible. Right. So that it's you're not relying on a civil servant to effectively write a sort of TripAdvisor style article on a supplier, because that's not fair.
Yeah, fair enough.
Why is that not fair, Ian?
It opens them up to litigation, and we know that if you take for example, Peter, the possibility of, did you deliver on time? That's an incontrovertible statement. That is, either the contract was extended or the contract was failed to be delivered on time. So either way, if you keep extending your contract, I'm not going to trust you as a supplier. Or if you or if you don't meet your timeline, I'm not going to trust you as a supplier. So that's a data point that we could really use that's incontrovertible.
It's a shame. I know what you mean. I think you're right, but it is a shame because we've all learned how to read TripAdvisor or check a trade, and work out what's the nonsense and what it really means. And it's sort of a shame we can't have something for suppliers, because we would be able to work out what was fair and what wasn't. But I agree with you, we probably all end up getting sued, so it's just a shame.
10 years ago,
you know that in Germany they've tried to come up with a very limited version of that, just around issues around supplier exclusion, for very serious misdemeanors, and it's taken them years and years because they keep getting tied up in legal challenges trying to just publish very, very basic data. But this company has had serious issues in terms of corporate governance, for example. So there are legal challenges, but that's not to say that there aren't perhaps other ways to be going about. It would have to be less formal, I think. But
I think you could ask 3 questions. Was did they deliver? What was the paid amount compared to the estimated start of the contract? Was it delivered on time? And then ask them the buyer to confirm whether all of the items requested were delivered. You can then do the same under social value. So if we said, actually, I expected someone's gender pay gap to shrink to less than 10% over the lifetime of this contract. If it didn't, it's non-controvertible. It's not an opinion. It did or it didn't.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I think Rory, you wanted to come in, and then Dan, I don't know if you wanted to respond to any of the points that have been raised there as well. I might come back to you, but go ahead, Rory.
Thank you. So setting aside issues of like suspension and debarment lists, which I think is an important topic, I would agree that the management of contracts and transparency post-award is really important, and I'm a big supporter of Chapter 6 of the Green Paper, which talked about open contracting and OCDS beyond just the award of the contract. And I think it does become very important in social value. But I would caution against the idea that it's just about the time when things are delivered, or it's just about meeting those commitments, because suddenly I think contracts that involve social value become more complex, and things may change. And we know, our academics know, people like Brown and Van Slyke have highlighted that when you're dealing with complex contracting, there needs to be sort of more flexible relational approaches. And, you need to sort of have more, like they call it commensurate, commensurate, no, it's slightly different. You need to have a more relational relationship throughout the, throughout the performance. And I think that becomes really important, because one of the things that I would suggest is it becomes very important with social value and transparency around social value is the supply chain and who's involved, because I think the expertise and the ability to set social priorities really does live in the community and often in the BCSE sector. So the opportunities to be involved in large contracts, the opportunities to set priorities around social value, it becomes a more complex issue. So I don't know that just by saying, did you meet the commitments you made at the start, is a sort of very sort of simple binary thing. But I do think we need the transparency to be able to manage that well.
Yeah, see where you're coming from there, Rory. Benjamin, did you want to come in as well? And then I think we'll need to wrap up pretty soon.
Thank you. I'll try and be quick. This might not be the right note to end on. I have to, in these conversations, as a bidder and provider to public services of competitive work, with actually my PSTA social enterprise hat as well as my consultancy hat on, somewhat resist taking the vox pops perspective, or just allowing my primal scream of frustration to escape. Let's be clear, public service tendering in the UK is very, 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 very broken. The tender portals are appalling. We have lock-in of all kinds. We have incredible waste in almost every single tendering process that we're involved in. It's not actually serving anybody. And I guess I just want to, I'll take a deep breath. I just want to draw attention to the fact that a lot of that is on a very practical level. The badness of tender portals to access the information and of search, it would be a brilliant test of a Turing complete AI if it could actually identify from the emails that are sent out from Contracts Finder and the like, what opportunities are relevant for any given organisation, because the categories don't do it, the descriptions don't do it, the OJU notices don't do it, and so on and so on. The logins are impenetrable, the software is bad, the duplication of effort of providing your insurance, which is not really necessary for most of the work, 1,000 times a year. I could go on, but I won't. And actually, the answers to that are really practical. Improve the procurement portals, create standardized approaches where you can register some of those compliance details and have them on the record forever. Reduce lock-in by following the Cabinet Office guidance around security clearance, cleared personnel and things like that. And do the evaluations better. Separate the track record and do a logo blind evaluation of methodology. You know, make the contracts more incremental so that you keep the carrot ahead of the buyer. Do some of that reporting. You know, surely I'm not the expert on any of this, but surely we could craft a legal framework such that a certain form of review could be done for which the supplier has already agreed in entering the tender process they cannot sue. I think actually there's loads of that work that still needs to be done. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thanks for that, Benjamin. Dan, did you have any last thoughts on this you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of add that going back to a point that was made a bit earlier about the kind of feedback that can be given, we very much follow that approach. And again, I'm only talking from the work that we do. We seek feedback in terms of time and quality, in terms of the capacity building resources that we see go from suppliers into local community-based organisations. Now, I understand that may sound like a transactional kind of relationship, but those local community-based organisations have been curated based on their ability to deliver local place-based outcomes. So there is a strategic top-down element to that process. But then we do collect feedback from those local organisations, and it can be as simple as something like a laptop that was provided to a community project was delivered on time and has the right software uploaded, and thereby fits the criteria that was set earlier. So yeah, we then conduct quite an elaborate evaluation at the end of the time period that we work with our customers. But yeah, there's a limited amount that you can do, but I do think you can get that kind of feedback information, and it can be used to feed into more elaborate evaluations.
Okay. Great. Well, we're getting very close to the end of our time. There is some interesting discussion going on in the chat, and some good links have been posted there as well. So please do have a look if you haven't already. But I'd just like to really thank everyone on our panel and who's contributed. I think you've really given, stimulated this discussion, and we've probably only scratched the surface. So I do hope we'll be able to come back to it in a later session. But for now, thank you very much for adding your point of view. And I'll hand over to Anne to close.
And massive thank you to Abby from me and the rest of the team for putting that session together and chairing it and taking the lead today. And just to pick up on that final point, this is definitely not going to be the last word on data. I know this is a subject that's of great interest to many of you, and we will be doing some further sessions on that in the future. And obviously, if you'd like to be involved, do please get in touch with Lee or Rory if you'd like to suggest yourself or suggest a theme for those further discussions. Two quick announcements before we go. There's a contracts template working group meeting on Tuesday. I don't know if Daniela's still on the call. You're welcome to pop up and say something if you are. Anybody who needs details of that, Lee should be able to help you with that if you need it. And then just to flag our next POGO call, which will be the last Tuesday in June. We've got Katarina Wehrlich from the European Commission, who's going to be talking about sustainable public procurement in Europe. And that promises to be a really exciting and stimulating discussion that we're all very much looking forward to. So hope to see lots of you at that session too. Thank you all very much and see you soon.
Great. Okay, thanks.